Today in this video lecture, we will learn about the cultural studies. We will learn about the historical development, its core content, key concepts and the important critics. We will try to understand how the cultural studies influence the development of literary theory. Dear friend, the lecture is full of information about the basic concepts of different literary terms, critics, and their views and their opinions. So I request you not to skip any part of the video and watch it till the end so that you can understand it very well. And please do like, share, subscribe my channel and comment too. So dear friend, the main objective of our lecture is to understand what is culture, how does culture play an important role in social life and literature in studies, its historical background, its development, core content, key concept and the important topics. We will also try to understand what is the goal of cultural studies, and we will try to widen the scope of our knowledge by understanding what is cultural studies. So dear friend, let us begin with the question, what is culture? How does culture plays an important role in social life and literature in studies? So dear friend, culture is basically an umbrella term which encompasses all social behavior and norm found in human societies, as well as the knowledge, belief, laws, arts, customs, capabilities, habits of the individuals in the groups. Human beings acquire culture through the learning process of the acculturation or enculturalization and socialization, which is shown by the diversity of cultures across the societies. So, and there are some types of cultures like Western culture, Eastern culture, Latin culture, then Middle Eastern culture, African culture. So there are so many types of cultures. So our main our main focus is what exactly cultural studies is, and therefore we try to define what is culture. So culture is an umbrella term. Nobody can define it specifically, but it includes, culture includes everything, right from the way we walk, we talk, we eat, everything is a culture. So it is a very simple thing. So then let us try to understand what exactly the cultural studies is. So cultural studies is an innovative interdisciplinary field of research and teaching that investigates the ways in which the culture creates and transforms the individual experience, everyday life, social relations and the power. So cultural studies studies the culture. Cultural studies, it studies how the culture creates and transforms the individual experience and everything's individual's lives, and how the culture is created, how it transforms. So cultural studies is relatively a very new field that took root towards the last quarter of the 20th century in England. So it is a name given to a varied approaches that initiated intellectual inquiries into different socio-political and cultural forms and practices. So it makes available certain ways of thinking about and understanding culture and of producing knowledge about it. There are microscopic and interpretive theories which focus on how individuals and the social groups use media to create and fosters new norms of cultures that structure everyday life. So these theories are referred to as a cultural theories. So what exactly the cultural studies include? See, cultural studies is a very vast and very varied type of a panorama. So cultural studies includes Marxism, post-structuralism, then postmodernism, popular culture. You can see here even the post-colonial studies, urban studies, queer studies, socialism, feminism, anthropology, film theory, modernism, identity, everything is included or is studied in the cultural studies. So there are four basic goals or characteristics of the cultural studies. So cultural studies, number one, denies the separation of high and low. See, or a popular culture or elite culture and a low culture. See, it denies the separation of the high culture and the low culture, or some sort of a elite or standard culture or a very popular culture. The second important goal of the or characteristics of the cultural studies is the cultural study is politically engaged. Okay, so there is a what we say a political influence is there in cultural studies. Then number third is it is interdisciplinary. It is not limited or it is not fixed with a one particular field of inquiry. And fourthly, cultural studies analyze not only the culture work but also the main of production. It inquires everything. So it is not about just the culture, it is about the way how the culture is transformed. Okay, so cultural studies has double ancestry. It comes first from a French structuralism in 1960s, which treated culture, including literature also, as a series of practices whose rules and conventions should be described. So, an early work of a cultural studies by a French literary theorist, that is the Roland Barthes, his work, that is mythology, has undertaken a brief reading of a range of cultural activities, from the professional wrestlings and the advertising of the cars and detergents to such a mythical cultural object as a French wine and the Einstein's brain. This is the first source of the cultural studies. And the another source of the cultural studies is a contemporary cultural studies is the Marxist literary theory in Britain, particularly in the work of the Raymond Williams. So these two are the basic source of origin that we can say. But cultural studies as a field originated in England when the various English scholars proposed the alternative mode of thinking about the culture. It begins prior to that in England. This was a reaction against the earlier conception of the culture proposed by the idealist and the essentialist theorists of a Victorian era, that is Matthew Arnold. So Matthew Arnold, who largely responsible for his reading culture with an idealistic and essentialistic lens. He wrote a book entitled as Culture and Anarchy in 1869. He explains his model of culture in which he distinguished the internal culture and the external culture. He favored the internal model of the culture, and the internal model of the culture aimed at the cultivating the inner self and eschewing all the material aspects of life, like amassing wealth or collecting the wealth and indulging in competition. So thus the model was based on the internal purifications, integrity and abstinence as opposed to the material prosperity and external affluence. He thought that the internal culture was corrupted and made impure by the advent of industrialization. He was against the commercial and material and competitive enterprise because that the only focused on the external aspect of the culture and distracted people from following a path of moral and mental purity and integrity. He defined the essence of culture as a sweetness and light. This essence advocated the pursuit of delight and wisdom, moral and social passion for doing good to others. Arnold's model was very much in tune with a traditional concept of culture as a process of human development. It emphasized the cultivation of refined behavior, mind, and society. It regarded culture as a passage of perfection, beauty, and wisdom. The attainment of culture was possible only by the person with a high taste, standards, and interest. His concept of culture, therefore, was elite, exclusive, and against the ordinary people. He restricted high taste and cultural interest to a minority group of a social elite, and this minority culture was against the mass culture, and so it was anti-democratic, reactionary, feudal, and divisive. So Arnold criticized the growing demand among the working class for socio-political rights and equality, stating that this deviated from what was ideal moral conduct. So they posed a threat of anarchy in absence of the established order that controlled and regulates the social and the moral conduct of the people. And so there was an urgent need to civilize them, means the people, into accepting the authority of the ideal culture. Now, Arnold's model of culture was further elaborated upon and reinforced by another influential British critic, that is F.R. Leavis. So, like Arnold, F.R. Leavis held the ordinary people responsible for failing down the standard of culture and social conduct. He dismissed the popular culture as a stereotype and anonymous and deficient in human experience. He complained against the corruption of taste and public behavior by mass media, technology, and advertising. He strongly advocated for educational institutions to counter the influence of the popular culture. He expected that educational institution should create a discriminating and highly trained intellectual elite who should given with a taste of preserving the culture of the English people and English tradition in literature. So in short, Lewis continued the Arnold's emphasis on minority culture of the elite with the expectation from the public functionaries like educational institution to create standards of behavior and to exclude the popular culture from the society. So this is what the thinking of F.R. Lewis. So F.R. Lewis continued the model of Arnold, and later on cultural studies in Britain challenged this classical and exclusive and anti-democratic conception of culture and inaugurated the new field of cultural studies. So the pioneering critic of this field, or the main or basic critic of this field, are Richard Hoggart, Raymond Williams, E.P. Thompson and Stuart Hall. So they can be rightly called as the four founding father of the cultural studies. So they are the just like the four wheels of the van of cultural studies. So there are some similarities in them. Okay, all of them were the adult educator working outside the mainstream of the university education and taught the working class of students. So they had a strong sympathy with the working class, and they were deeply influenced by the Marxist thought, and they actively participated in the left wing politics. So such similarities among these critics collectively contributed towards the establishment of this field as a mode of thinking and practice. So it became an academic practice that dealt with the both academic and non-academic topic. These critics carried out their studies in different areas and with different analytical method, but their objective were similar. They took the traditional high culture and exposed it to the series of deep and exhaustive investigation. As the inquiry moved into different socio-political fields, a wide range of the critical ideas and models became available to the practitioner of the cultural studies. As a result, the operative range of the interpretive strategies multiplied. So this critical theory and practice in Europe was influenced by the work of Antonio Gramsci, Walter Benjamin, Louis Althusser, Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, Julia Kristeva, Jacques Derrida, Roland Barthes. Okay, so there are so many other things, and this heterogeneous and often radical legacy was carried forward by these theorists and critics like Stuart Hall, Tony Bennett, then Lawrence Grossbergs, and Willis. Okay, so these and many other critics derived the ideas from the critical theory and applied them to the different aspects and the areas of the society. So cultural studies, what is the core content? What is the main content of the cultural studies? So cultural studies draws on various fields and yet does not completely identify with any of those fields. So it blurs the boundaries between itself and the other fields. So it is ecclesiastic, it is pluralistic, it is very choosy in its approach, it is multivalent in its subjects and methods of analysis. So it has no specific methodology and therefore no fixed framework of analysis. So it is not a definitive in its claim and argument, and it does not regard its analysis of cultural practice like literature and language as final and fixed. Okay, so owing to this comprehensive range and the interdisciplinary nature, it is very difficult to attempt a clear-cut definition of cultural studies. However, the theorists offered a commentary on the cultural studies which can provide the insight into its complex nature. Okay, Stuart Hall, the important critic of the cultural studies, he defines cultural studies as a cluster, as a group, as a cluster of ideas, images, and practices which provide the ways of talking about and forms of knowledge and conducts associated with a particular topic social activity or institutional sites in society. Okay, so after looking at the core content of the cultural studies, let us try to point out some important figures or important critics in cultural studies. Okay, so the first important critic is Richard Hoggart. Okay, so Richard Hoggart was a professor of English at Brigham University. Okay, he was the first cultural critic who laid the foundation of the cultural studies as a field of intellectual inquiry. His book, The Uses of Literacy, which he published in 1957, and his establishment of the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in 1964 made him the prominent figure and brought his ideas into the public discussions. So the main contribution of the Richard Hoggart is his establishment of this center for the contemporary cultural studies, and the name of the center is the Brigham Center. Okay, Brigham Center for the Contemporary Cultural Studies. Now, his main concern was to advocate the expression of the working class life and consciousness. So, he interpreted the working class life as an energizing experience that could strengthen the people to face the difficulty of life. He he said that he argued that the everyday activity of the working class were not trivial and debased, but enriching experience that made them strong and adaptable to the changing condition. His task was to replace the old minority culture with the mass culture, but he feared that consumerism and mass consumption would make his community hedonist and passive. So this is what he about the another important critic who greatly contributed to the establishing the theoretical parameters of the cultural studies was Raymond Williams. He was the professor of drama in Cambridge University after working as an adult educator. His book Culture and Society, 1780 to 1950, that he had written in 1958, 1958 year, and The Long Revolution in 1961 presented cultural history in the light of the Marxist thought. So he had written two important books, and number one is the Culture and Society. It is a study of culture and society from 1780 to 1950. Okay, that book he had written in 1958. And another important book that he has written is The Long Revolution in 1961. In both of these books, he presented the cultural history in the light of the Marxist thought, and he developed his own theory called as the cultural materialism, and he examined the English canonian literary text from the materialist cultural point of view. He criticized the ideological role of the English education system and literary text in preserving the minority culture and excluding the culture of a large section of society from any kind of serious consideration. So he offered a sustained critique of both the canonical literature or literary tradition and the high culture. In the nutshell, his contribution can be summed up as number one, he examined the English literary tradition from Edmund Burke to George Orwell to explain the contemporary socio-political, cultural, and try to define the modern democratic industrial society. Secondly, He provided the historical basis for understanding culture, and he defined culture not as a fixed universal category but as a complex and dynamic process. So number fourth next important contribution of it is he categorized the culture into three division. Okay, number one is dominant. Okay, number two is the residual, and number three is the emergent culture. So, with Williams, the British cultural studies generally we see a movement away from the elitist and the idealist version of the culture towards an alternative version that recognizes the dynamism and complexity of the late capitalist society. The web-like concept connections that links the subcultures and the various class in formations within the overlapping regions and the national national frameworks. So the another important critic is E.P. Thompson. He was an influential British social historian and a political activist. He was devoted Marxist and was against any kind of unmindful and ideological exercise of power. He reinterpreted the concept of culture and argued that working class is not a descriptive label, but it is a historical phenomenon developed over a time. Okay, so his most important or the influential work was the making of the English working class that he has written in 1963, which he presented the historical analysis of the working class community. Now, this working class was E.M. Thompson's great contributions to the British cultural studies, because by presenting the historical study of the working class community, it opened a new field of critical study that is called a social history. So the another important critic is the Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall was a cultural theorist and the sociologist who contributed significantly to the theoretical setup of the cultural studies. He can rightly called as the father of cultural studies because not only he contributed to the radical new perspectives to the field, but also he brought many areas which were considered unfit for the academic studies under the preview of the cultural studies. Means he not only contributed in a radical thought of the cultural studies, but he brought the other studies into the field for the investigation. So that is important thing. He was a committed Marxist, but he never became the member of the Communist Party. Hall's work is wide-ranging, interdisciplinary, and collaborative. His approach was pluralistic and dynamic. He was, along with his colleague at Birmingham Center, he dealt with the subjects such as politics, racism, ideology, ethnicity, gender, press, television, broadcasting, photography, violence, crime, and everything. So Hall was influenced by the Gramsci's notion of hegemony and analyzed the cultural practice from this point of view. He examined power, subjectivity, identity, and important perspectives to understand the complex working of the culture and introduced new topics like multiculturalism, migrations, exile, and the diaspora in the domain of the cultural studies. So this is what the important thing about the Stuart Hall, and this is what the main contribution of the Stuart Hall in cultural studies. So dear friend, now let us try to see what are the different types or what are the different variants of the cultural studies. So we can divide the cultural studies either by say theme wise or the region wise. Okay, so let us try to divide it region wise. Okay, so the first important variant that we come across is a British and the American cultural studies. Okay, so British and the American cultural studies is to some extent it is the same, but American cultural studies is different from the British trend in some other respects. So British cultural studies emerged out of a sociological and a materialistic cultural studies of the culture, whereas the cultural studies in America was concerned in the early phase with the historical analysis of the political traditional figures and the economy. British cultural studies was conscious of being British, whereas American version is more international in its approach. So British version is against the minority culture that represented the high culture of the elite group of the society, whereas the American version has found a new voice in minority scholars like Edward Said, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. Okay. So the another important variant of the cultural studies is the Australian cultural studies. Australian cultural studies became prominent in the late 1970s. There are so many conditions, so many reasons were responsible for the emergence of it. Uh, some of them or important among them was number one, the renewal interest in the Australian culture and the history. Then we find the development of the nationally focused traditional tradition of media and the mass film studies. Then the opening up of the publishing market for the Australian cultural studies, etc. But the most important impetus was provided by the British intellectual immigrant who came to Australia in search of job in the late 70s. So this includes the Tony Bennett, then John Hartley, Colin Misser, David Slander. So all these critics they came from Britain with their orientation and methods of analysis, and they were influenced. They were influenced by the mm, Birmingham Marxism of Hoggart and Hall, and at the same time by the European theories like Sir Ferdinand de Saussure, semiotics, and the French post-structuralism. So they applied the interdisciplinary approach of European critical theory and the British Marxism in their cultural analysis. So Australian version focused on the representation of the Australian culture in different form and effect, which representations produced on the pursuers. A parallel movement to this was going on during the 1970s was a local tradition of the film and the media analysis. Okay, so in the succeeding year, this tradition of the film and the media studies dominated the Australian cultural studies, and these two tradition in the Australian cultural studies, that is the studies of Australian culture and film and media studies, were not very complementary to each other. However, they diversely contributed to the establishment of the cultural studies as an important field of inquiry in Australia. Then the another important variant of the cultural studies is the African and the Asian variety. Okay, so the African and the Asian variety of the cultural studies have been diverse and complex. Okay, it is as diverse and as complex as the Anglo-American forms, but they have been markedly different from the Anglo-American in one way or the other. Okay, and the most important crucial thing is that the process of the colonialization has a huge impact on their development. So the factor that differentiate the Afro-Asian form from the Anglo-American form are number one, the colonialization of the many Afro-American, Afro-Asian countries by the European ruler. Okay. Then secondly is the intervention of the native cultural practice. Then the deliberation of the representation of the colonies as the inferior and the uncivilized locations. Then we have the consequent freedom gained by the colonies from their masters. Okay, and then we have the post-colonial conditions that situates the colonies and the unease and conflicting spaces of the colonial effects and the post-colonial socio-political systems. And more recently, the globalizations and the pushing of the ex-colonies into the entirely new world order. So the post-colonial discourse have mostly been sides of the resistance to the Europe of on the one hand and the examination of the internal history and the socio-political conditions of the new nations and the states on the other hand. So the issues of the immigrant, multiculturalism, race, gender, identity have become major concern of the Afro-Asian intellectuals. So the another important variant is the European cultural studies. So the European cultural studies provides the important perspectives and the models of the analysis to the Afro-Asian critics. And they have drawn extensively from the critical theories like Gramsci, Althusser, Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault. Okay, the history of the Afro-Asian cultural studies is not separate from the history of the post-colonial and the intellectual movements. So it may be seen that the emerging from the writings of the Fanon and the consolidated and elaborated in the new directions by the Edward Said, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, Homi Bhabha. Okay, so the cultural studies has been and continues to be diversely practiced by the critics like the Perry, then the Trinath, Aziz Ahmad, okay, and then the Arjun Aplaudikar, Gyan Prakash, okay, Romilia Thapar, then Dipesh Chakravarti, and so many critics. So these and other critics have dealt with almost all areas of the cultural practice, from nationality to ethnicity, and from gender politics to the identity crisis. So everything. So dear friend, this is what my thoughts about the cultural studies, its developments, its key concepts, and the important critique. Hope you understand it, you like it. So dear friend, please like, share, subscribe my channel and comment on my video. Thank you. Thanks for watching.